All right. I guess we'll get started for the afternoon's events. I'm William Marati, associate professor in the history department here, and I'm very delighted to introduce the three panelists for this session. Yet another three modes of, I guess, loosely performance would be appropriate. We will have papers on art and performance, on music that is definitely not the Peanuts, and dance in the form of buto. And I'll be, I guess, popping up like a jackrabbit to introduce each of the presenters one by one. I'll start by introducing the first. Alan Cummings, who's here from London, from SOAS, the University of London, the Department of Languages and Cultures in Japanese and Korean. I believe I got close enough. A senior teaching fellow. Is also a graduate of that department from 2010. Alan is predominantly an expert on the bloody, gruesome, and rather strangely compelling world of 19th century kabuki. But I've also known of a second hat that he's worn for a number of years, which is as a frequent contributor to The Wire and to other publications and websites of those who know, related to mostly 60s and 70s forms of radical music encompassing free jazz, psychedelia, noise, folk, pretty much you name it. And so I'm very happy that he's here and putting on an academic hat to talk about some of this once again. So will you please welcome Alan Cummings.
Thank you, Bill, for that kind introduction. Thank you to the Terasaki Center for organizing this wonderful event. And thank you to my fellow panelists for stimulating papers which have been and are still to come. Today, a little note to begin with. You may note that I've removed one word from my original title, which is in the catalog. I was going to talk a little bit about fascism, but fascism has been soundly expunged from the presentation for this afternoon. So today I want to talk to you about a Japanese guitarist, a man called Takayanagi Masayuki, who in that great jazz tradition has a nickname by which he is often referred, and Takia is often just known as Jojo in Japan. In particular, I want to focus in on a couple of issues. Firstly, the idea of free jazz as a transnational approach to music making. We often associate it just with the US, but there are similar styles and approaches to music making happening in Japan and in Europe and South Africa, lots of different places around about the same time from the mid to late 60s onwards. So thinking about free jazz as a transnational approach to music making and the applicability of that particular term to what was happening in the Japanese music world of the late 60s and early 1970s. And secondly, as part of a longer project I have to bring the Japanese music of this period back into dialogue with other forms of radical art, I want to say one or two things about the connections that Takia Nagi forged between the theory and the practice of his music and wider social formulations at a very particular historical moment. Takia Nagi is often talked about by various writers and critics and theorists as a free jazz musician, though that particular term is never one that he himself used to refer to either himself or his music. And even though the term free jazz itself is an amorphous and a very difficult to pin down one, it's also a term that raises important questions, some of the kind of things we've been talking about here today already, cultural flow, appropriation, and about the relationship between tradition and innovation in improvised artistic forms. I guess a definition of free jazz then would probably be a a good place to start. I'm not sure how many people here listen to that kind of thing. But I guess in musical terms at least, you can think of it as a reaction against certain structural ingredients that were orthodox to hard bop, which was the dominant jazz style since the mid-50s. So things like melodic lines that conform to a chord structure, an adherence to a steady rhythmic pulse in a 12-bar or 32-bar form, and finally a feeling of swing. Swing, that's another word that's very hard to define, but that sensation you get of a rhythmic pulse rushing forward when in reality it's doing anything but that. But in the US from the mid-1950s onwards, a number of musicians begin to push against these structural musical orthodoxies in different ways. For example, Ornette Coleman reordered the structural principles of his compositions to give his group maximum melodic and rhythmic freedom by allowing each musician to play inside or outside conventional chord, bar, pitch, and tempo relationships. Another name some of you may have heard of, Cecil Taylor or Cecil Taylor, depending on how you like to pronounce that. His music of the same period, late 50s into the early 60s, defies a metronomic pulse set up by bass and drums, using sudden leaps between intervals, shifting dynamics, and a very percussive attack on the keyboard to create surges of energy that overwhelm the meter. There are lots of other musicians who are involved in this style of music making, this form, each experimenting in different ways with it. So people like John Coltrane, of course, Sun Ra, Albert Ayler, Bill Dixon, Roscoe Mitchell, Eric Dolphy, Pharoah Sanders, etc., etc. It's Ornette Coleman. He releases an album in 1960 called Free Jazz. It's this album which provides the most popular shorthand for this style of experimentation within jazz, though it's not the only term which is used at the beginning. From its inception, this style of music making was a particularly controversial one. Writers and critics, depending on where they positioned themselves in the debate, some of them talked about freeform, some of them talked about abstract jazz, some of them talked about atonal jazz, some of them talked about anti-jazz, if they particularly were not fond of it. Some talked about avant-garde, some talked about space music, some talked about the new thing. There's a whole heap of terms which get used to refer to what's going on. And really from its beginnings, free jazz is divisive in a way that earlier innovations in jazz had not been. Earlier developments like that of bebop, for example, had soon revealed continuities with older traditions, and in spite of their initial radicalism, were soon reincorporated back into the tradition with a quick rewriting of its boundaries. This is something which doesn't happen with free jazz. The techniques and their implications, particularly in terms of the questions they raise about jazz's identification with artistic modernism and the challenging nature of the sound itself, create an intense debate on whether this development could be included as part of the forms, as part of jazz's historical development at all. And really since then, free jazz has been situated on the margins of that tradition, by a certain number of conservative critics. And essentially free jazz has been used, marginalized, and excluded in a way to solidify and define the canon. Jazz is essentially all those things which free jazz is not. So free jazz, you can talk about it in musical terms as I've just done, but of course it's not just defined by its approaches to the production of sound. There's also the issue of cultural identity, of the socially derived meanings that both musicians and listeners attach to it. Adorno has argued in Philosophy of New Music that not all musical works are possible at all times. He talks about the tendency for musical material to change over time due to what he calls, in quotes, sedimented spirit, i.e. the composer, he's mostly talking about composers, but the composer or the performer's individual experiences of his or her socio-political and cultural environment. With US free jazz critics and academics, people like Philippe Carl, Jean-Louis Comolli, Amiri Baraka, Eric Drott, and others have argued for connections with a wide-ranging of overlapping socio-political issues, particularly black liberation, due to the period when this is happening. Others have talked to the centrality of spiritual liberation and religious experience. The chronologically parallel free improvisation movement in Europe had a constellation of similar musical concerns. There was a bit greater, a bit wider openness to ideas taken from contemporary composition. Many of the European musicians were also engaged very closely with oppositional leftist politics. For example, the British group AMM, who deployed Marxist theory in order to develop a working musical ideology and practice. But it's this combination, I think, of socio-political and cultural context with radical approaches to form and technique that define free jazz as a genre. So what's going on in Japan then? In Japan there had been several earlier briefer episodes of jazz experimentation. For example, in 1962, Takia Nagi, a bassist called Kanai Hideto, and a painter called Kageyama Isamu, formed a musicians collective called the Shinseiki Ongaku Kenkyujo, the New Century Musical Research Institute. And every Friday, members would gather at a Ginza chanson bar called Gin Pari to push the outer limits of jazz creativity. One famous Japanese critic of the time, a man called Soejima Teruto, reports that those who refused to deal with the experimentation that was central to these gatherings were quickly shown the door. He remembers an established show drummer turning up one night and starting to play a conventional rhythm. All of the other musicians in the bandstand then quietly trooped off stage and left him to it. There's an interesting formalism to many of the experiments at Gin Pari that owed little to the still developing directions of US free jazz. There are things like stringless guitars, dealing out cards with random chords written on them in order to structure a tune, pieces based on the rhythm of Morse code, Rorschach inkblot tests used as graphic scores, etc., etc. But there's really, I think, little marriage between the experimentation, the musical experimentation, and the context, the historical context of that moment. For that, we have to wait until a little bit later in the 1960s. As we move, come 1967, 68, 69, you begin to get an increasing churn of musical and critical activity that is sufficient, I think, to begin to define a Japanese free jazz. Musicians were mostly based in Tokyo, included Takia Nagi, I've already mentioned, pianists like Sato Masahiko, Yamashita Yosuke, saxophonists Abe Kaoru, Takagi Mototeru, the bassist Yoshizawa Motoharu, and drummer Togashi Masahiko. There were also, of course, important critics who were actively interested in the possibilities and the promotion of this form of music, including Soejima Teruto, I already mentioned, Shimizu Toshihiko, the author Nakagami Kenji, and later another critic called Aida Akira. The dissemination of free jazz in Japan was largely through recordings, though it does have its own John Cage moment in the form of the July 1966 tour of Japan by John Coltrane's group, which was then at the absolute height of its free jazz phase. But the reason why I want to focus on Takia Nagi today is that out of all these musicians I've mentioned, he's the one who constantly pushes to develop a theoretical basis for what he's doing in terms of technique. And quite unusually for a musician, Takia Nagi saw writing about music as just as important a tool as music making itself. So he's left behind a quite astonishingly rich, dense, and very frequently vituperative set of writings. He was actually very famous for burning every bridge he had behind him, to the extent by the end of his life he was essentially playing by himself with audiences of 2 or 3 people. But he's left behind this amazing set of writings, essays, critical pieces, reviews, roundtable conversations. And these display a really intense engagement with the forms and the history of this music, an awareness that any new advances in it are not going to be dependent upon any spurious ideas about authenticity or that idea of this is a musical form which is coming from the US and we have to imitate it. To help us, to come to a clearer understanding of just what kinds of interventions Takia Nagi was aiming at with his music, I want to talk about two specific moments now. The first is his development of two specific techniques for collective free improvisation that he begins to formulate in 1969-70, and he continues to use in performance and recording up until the mid-1980s. The second is his attempt to draw lessons from these techniques in terms of the ways that they function in the wider physical and social world. And to get at that particular question, I'll examine briefly the response of one particular audience at a festival called the Genyasai, which was held in opposition to the construction of Narita Airport at Sanrizuka in August 1971. Technique first, then. Technique and a theoretical understanding of how music functioned had always been key to Takia Nagi's career. He was somebody who dropped out of high school at the age of 16 in order to become a professional musician. He was born in 1932, so he's of that pre-war generation. He soon gained a reputation for a very accomplished command of a wide variety of musical techniques and approaches, and also the ability to sight read anything that was put in front of him. Though his talent guaranteed him a comfortable career comping behind popular jazz singers, he was also very, very musically restless, and that led him to form a string of short-lived groups. In the early 1950s, he puts together his first group called New Direction, which was a radical, for the time, pianoless quartet that parallels certain contemporary developments in the US by people like Teddy Charles and Jerry Mulligan. In 1961, he has another group called the Jazz Academy Quartet, where he makes a break from the domination of the four-beat, that rigid four-beat that you often get with jazz, to experiment with different styles of free tempo playing. But it's in 1969, August 1969, that he forms a new group called New Directions. The earlier one was New Direction. He uses that term over and over. With a bassist called Yoshizawa Motoharu and a younger drummer called Toyozumi Yoshisaburo. And this group would rehearse in a windowless first-floor walk-up next door to a tempura restaurant in Shinjuku. Officially, the space was an instrument storage room for a nearby jazz club called Pit Inn. And Toyozumi recalls that Takia Nagi would show up at rehearsals with them, with exercises for them to work on. He would say, for example, play fortissimo, never repeat the same phrase, don't listen to what anyone else is doing. That was a staggering concept for us. At another rehearsal, Takia Nagi showed up with scores where the bar lines had been obliterated by thick black marker. Fill up all the space, was what he told them. And as was common with most free jazz musicians, this is something you see in the American style, European style as well, each musician really develops a highly personal palette of extended techniques for their instrument in order to extend its expressive potential, often microtonally. Takia Nagi would use a bass bow and he would use a butter knife against the strings of his guitar, quote, to prevent the tedious repetition and the stagnation of change. Volume was also very, very key to what he was doing. The more you want to communicate, the louder it's got to be, was what he said. And these kinds of experiments eventually lead to the creation of two basic frameworks for improvisation. One of which he refers to Shudan Tosha, mass projection, and the other Zenji Tosha, gradually projection, which doesn't seem to make much sense in English, but that's how he gives it in katakana as well, which is why I've gone for gradually rather than gradual. He was aware of the ironies and dangers of creating an overly prescriptive system in order to enable acts of free improvisation. So these systems are, in fact, inherently flexible in terms of what they demand from the performers. He describes them tellingly as the smallest possible framework to prevent inertia and tedium. And in a 1975 interview, he elaborates on the differences between the two frameworks. I'm going to read this a fairly long quote, but please bear with me. Mass projection and gradually projection both constitute a single rough framework. At the very beginning, they simply signified density, speed, and volume. Mass projection encompasses gradually, and gradually encompasses mass. Even at this stage, you can see that they frame a considerable potential for diversity. Additionally, gradually projection possesses the qualities of both repose and motion. It creates a static state within its flow and is thus orientated towards diffusion and destruction. The structures and forms created are in a perpetually repeating cycle of either slippage towards the interior or else breaking out towards the exterior. Gradually projection is thus a time scale for the advance or the retreat of thought, and in general it can be said to represent space. Mass projection is a compunctionless, concentrated motion of the whole consciousness, calling for the intensification of each musician's abilities to their fullest extent. In the action of confronting the roots of falsehood and attempting to mercilessly smash to smithereens, we must become an unremitting blast furnace. Each musician must become an unwavering fanatic. In some senses, it is also desirable for the musicians to even abandon their humanity. We need to become something stronger than human beings. This is the basic proposition. Thus, diffusion and destruction within the quality of the movable, the union of these elements produces dynamism. If you have a succession of multiple events that change as velocity is accelerated to its maximum and which continue for an extended period of time, eventually you arrive at a different kind of static phenomenon. This is only natural and requires no further elucidation. Likewise, in a space where upstream and progressive thought has been concentrated to such an extent that they surge together, this must mean that time also equals mass projection, which is all fairly verbose and a little bit difficult to figure out. But I'll play you a couple of quick examples of these two approaches to give you a better sense of what he's talking about. The first is from Takia Nagi's first album with this group called Independence, recorded in September 1969 and released in 1970. So this is an example of the gradually projection type. So that's the gradually projection type. The second, I'm going to play a little piece of a mass projection recorded in February 1970. I guess you can hear that those two things are relatively different. So the mass projection type, it seems to involve a dense, accelerated, somewhat chaotic coloring in of space that destroys the listener's perception of time and thus of musical development. Gradually projection allows for a greater amount of silence and thus an appreciation of the spatial arrangement of successful musical events within it. For Takia Nagi, these kinds of approaches, as I said, these are the two key approaches he develops and uses up until the mid-80s. They're a combination of the technical, the personal, and the political. As I said, he was very well known